These tents behind me were not hot tents until today when I installed DIY stove jacks in each of them. So now I can take them camping any time of the year and stay toasty warm inside. Maybe you've got a tent that you'd like to put a stove jack in so you can do some hot tenting yourself. Well, I'm going to show you 5 easy DIY ways that you can add a stove jack to your tent. This works quite well on a number of different tents from different makes and models, including Kodiak, Spring Bar, Teton, White Duck, and many others. Some of these methods will also work on synthetic tents, including nylon and polyester materials. Beware that once you cut a hole in your tent, there's no turning back. You might void your tent's warranty, you might end up with leaks, and if you mess it up, you've got a big repair to sort out. Proceed at your own risk.
Gear up and get outside.
Note that most of these methods can be done with pretty simple tools and inexpensive materials that you can order online or stuff you already have at home, like what you see here. I'm going to give you the materials and tools you need for each one of these methods. I'll also put links to these in the description below for wherever I can find them. Those are affiliate links. You're not obligated to use them, but if you do, it helps support the channel. Also, if you're more of a written instructions person, you'll be able to check out the article on our website where I'm going to post the full details and step-by-step instructions there as well. The link to that article will also be in the description below. This first method I call silicone flashing only. It's relatively simple. The only material you'll need is a flexible silicone flue stove flashing kit. It's kind of a mouthful and there's a number of them out there. Just make sure you get the right size for your chimney or your flue from your tent stove. The only tools you'll need for this are a pin, a knife, maybe some scissors, and a wrench if your flashing kit requires it. This option only costs about 30 to 80 bucks depending on the size of flashing kit you need, and the level of effort is low, it's not very hard, and it doesn't require much time. This method works best for durable canvas tents, whether it's a bell tent, a wall tent, or some other kind of cotton canvas cabin tent. It's not really great for synthetic tents because I think it'll rip right through the material. So here's how you do it. First step, you need to pitch your tent. Next, you're going to trim the flashing to fit your flue pipe with scissors or a knife, and make sure to account for any kind of heat shield you might use or any kind of walled pipe. Then you want to decide where you're going to place your stove inside your tent. Once you've figured out where you're going to place your stove, go ahead and mark the pipe exit location with a pen or pencil on the canvas. I found that a pen works better. Once I mark the center of where that pipe should exit, I trace the inside and outside of one of the flanges on the inside of the tent, and I also traced where each of those little bolt holes should go. After that, I just cut a little X where the bolt hole should go through the canvas. I made sure to stick a bolt in and out just to make sure I had the right fit. Be careful not to jab your knife in too far or you're gonna have a big repair to make. Once I had those bolt holes cut out, I placed the flange from the inside and stuck the bolts through. That held the flange in place so that I could go around on the outside and attach the exterior flange and the little wing nuts on it. I tightened those down to hand tight, and then I cut the hole from the inside of that flange. I like doing it this way because I was able to just use that flange as a template and cut around, and then I was sure not to cut into where those bolt holes would be so that it wouldn't come and strip out on me later. Once the hole was there, I removed the flanges on both ends, and then I placed the outer flange in first with the bolt holes going in from the exterior, male end pointing to the interior of the tent. Once the exterior flange was in place, I went inside and I stuck the flashing kit through from the inside, the male end pointing out. And also note that I have the rubber flashing part inside, not outside. The reason that's important is because you don't want that canvas exposed if at all possible, and that makes it so there's no canvas exposed right around the pipe. It also gives you a better water seal in my opinion. Then I placed the inner flange on the bolts and I tightened those wing nuts up. I had to use a wrench from the outside to get a few of them all the way tight. They don't have to be crazy tight, just enough that they won't come loose. This step would have been a little easier with a buddy. Now here's some pros and cons about this method. The pros are that minimal tools and supplies are required to do it. It's also rather quick to do. It didn't take me very long compared to the other things I did. And that silicone flashing provides good heat protection because it's an insulator and it won't dissipate the heat through the material of the tent. The cons are that you always have that flashing sticking outwards. You also have exposed bolts, and those exposed bolts, when you pack up that tent, could cause problems or cause tears or rips, so just beware and be careful how you pack it. It makes it a little cumbersome to roll up that tent as well. The other thing is you're always going to have an exposed hole in the wall or on the roof of the tent if you put this on a roof. In wind or rain or snow, that could be a problem if you're not using your tent stove. But you could come up with a clever situation like I did by just taking my dog's bowl and setting it over top of that. Not sure that'll stick in a windstorm though. So this may not be the greatest solution when you want to have a tent that's versatile and that you're going to use all seasons, including in summer when you don't plan on using a tent stove. One thing to keep in mind when you're going to order the parts to do this, or the materials to do this, is that you want to make sure you've got the right size diameter of a stove jack. The most common pipe sizes for chimneys or flues on these tent stoves is 2.5 inches or 3.5 inches. There are bigger and there are smaller, but these are very, very common sizes. So make sure if you've got a smaller tent or a smaller tent stove that you've got the appropriately sized jack, and same goes for the larger. This big hole would accommodate almost up to a 6-inch diameter, I believe. So if you've got something like this big walled pipe from my winter well stove, that will fit in just fine with a little room to grow, and that would be a good install in my opinion. Whereas if all I got is a 2.5-inch chimney pipe and I don't have a walled pipe, that would work, but you're gonna have a lot of draft coming in through there and you're gonna lose some heat. So try to make that as efficient as possible. If you get one that's too big, you can usually size down even if you add a flashing kit over top. But if you get one that's too small, you're gonna have to do some cutting to make it work. Just pay attention to that when you order your parts. The next way is to sew in a pre-made stove jack, like I did on my Kodiak Flex-bow tent here. This one's a little harder than the first. The materials you're going to need include a ready-made stove jack, some waxed synthetic thread, and some seam sealer. The tools you're going to need include a sewing needle, or maybe a sewing machine if you're into that, or a sewing awl. Like I used the Speedy Stitcher and it worked great. You'll also need a pen or pencil, a knife, and some tape to hold the stove jack up. This cost me about $65, including the Speedy Stitcher. The level of effort on this one is high. It took me the longest, and it's not that fun, unless you're into sewing. In my opinion, this is best for a canvas tent sidewall installation. It could also work with synthetic tents, so long as you seal those seams with silicone and use the right kind of synthetic thread. Here's how you do it. First, you need to pitch your tent. Then you need to decide where you're going to place your tent stove. Mark the pipe exit location with a pen or pencil. Then you're going to mark your stove jack position, roughly where that's going to be, where you want that hole to be. Now's the scary part. You got to cut an X where that hole is going to be. This is where the pipe is going to go through eventually, but in the installation process, it's going to be an access hole for the sewing part. Then position the stove jack on the exterior with some tape. It doesn't have to be perfect. Now the time-consuming part. You need to sew that stove jack in place. You're going to sew around the entire perimeter. Ideally, you would double stitch it. I ran out of time today, so I just did the one. I'll probably go back and do another round later. One thing I learned is this would be easier with a helper inside. You could move a little quicker if you're using that Speedy Stitcher. And while the quality of my stitching might be questionable, I think this is going to be durable enough to hold up. I started out with shorter stitches, but when I realized how long this was going to take, my stitches got a little longer. Unfortunately, in my case, practice does not make perfect, or rather, I don't want to practice in order to become perfect at this. I just want it to be good enough. And I think this is. Once you're fully sewn in, you're going to want to cut out the canvas from inside the tent. Be very careful not to cut through your stove jack as well. It might be better to do this with scissors. You want to leave a nice big perimeter around that hole for your pipe where there's no canvas and it's just that silicone fiberglass material of the stove jack. This will help prevent that stovepipe from heating up your canvas walls. As you can see in my case, it wasn't pretty, but it does the job. The pros of this method are that it is durable. I think it's also going to have a lot of longevity. I think it will last a long time. It should be relatively weatherproof, especially with that seam sealer, although with my bigger stitches I might find that I need to go back through one more time. However, I think that could be prevented if you double stitch. It also works nicely whether you have the stove in there or not. So for all season summertime campers, when you're not always going to be using that stove, this is a great way to go, because you can just roll that flap down from the outside and it'll Velcro in place. The cons are that it's time consuming. It's not good for procrastinators, and that much sewing kind of sucks. It also requires a little more finesse than the alternatives. So if you're impatient, this might not be the best option for you. One alternative is that you could just first sew on Velcro strips on the outside of your tent and then buy one of those ready-made stove jacks that just Velcros in place. You'd still need to sort out a separate canvas panel that would flap over when you're not using the stove, but that might be an option you like too. I prefer this way. I hope you're liking this video more than I dislike sewing in that stove jack. If you are, do me a favor and hit that thumbs up button. The next message, which is a little easier than sewing a stove jack in, is gluing in a pre-made stove jack. The materials you'll need for this are the ready-made stove jack, some Terraminder fabric adhesive, some masking tape, a small paintbrush, it can be a cheap one, and maybe some gloves if you don't want to get a mess on your hands. The tools you'll need are a knife, a pen, a putty knife, and then some kind of hard surface or table really makes it a lot easier. This option costs between $40 and $50 for all the materials. The level of effort is medium. There's lots of steps, but it does move pretty quickly. This is best for a canvas tent roof installation, although you could do it on a wall as well. It could work on a synthetic tent if you've got a synthetic stove jack and silicone for your sealant, but it might not be as strong on a synthetic tent. Here's how you do it. First, you need to pitch your tent. Then again, you need to decide where you want that tent stove to be inside of your tent, and make sure that the stove jack is not going to have to overlay any seams on the outside. I had to fidget around with this one a little bit to get it set where I want the stove to be, but also where I wouldn't be trying to go over any seams. Those seams could result in leaks down the road. If the edge of that stove jack peels over time, you're gonna get water in there and that could be a problem. Once you know where your stove's going, mark the pipe exit location with a pin. Then you're gonna wanna verify that stove jack position from the outside. You may wanna mark the entire stove jack position just by outlining the entire jack if you want. Next, if you do it like I did, you're gonna wanna put some kind of table inside under there, and you're gonna need to collapse the tent on top so that you have a flat, hard surface to work on. I found it handy to kind of tape the stove jack in place at this point, then working on one edge at a time. First, I masked off the outside edge of the jack by putting tape on the tent side. That just helps so that adhesive doesn't get too messy and spread all over. Now you have to work pretty fast because that tear mender adhesive dries fast. You're gonna wanna apply adhesive to both sides, both the tent side of the material and the back side of that stove jack, using that little paintbrush. Once you've got it evenly applied, and don't use too much like I did, otherwise you have a mess to clean up, but then you're gonna press the two sides together and then smooth them out using the putty knife, trying to push the air out. Don't do it so much that you evacuate all of the adhesive, but make sure you do it enough that you get good adhesion. This also helps get the creases out and make sure that adhesive is spread evenly. Give it a few minutes to set, and then you can remove all that masking tape. Very satisfying. Next, you're gonna wanna cut out the canvas from around the hole, leaving an inch or two around it. You do want some overlap, but you want to clear that hole so that the pipe is never in contact directly with the canvas. The pros of this option is that it's very weatherproof. Okay, it's the next morning and it didn't rain last night, but given this weird weather we've been having, we've got a lot of condensation on the tent. Quite a bit, beaten up. So I wanted to show you how this looks the next day. So despite all the water droplets that have been running on and over it, it looks like all that adhesive is holding quite well. Nothing's peeling up, despite my little bit subpar job in some cases. And from the inside, same thing. No evidence of moisture coming in, other than a little bit dripping down the pipe, but that's to be expected the way I've got it. It also lays flat, which will make it easier to pack up. There's a really strong bond between the tent and the stove jack. That tear mender is strong. And this is also a nice option because it works with or without that stove inside. This is the White Duck Regatta Bell Tent, the 360 version that has the bottom level that all rolls up and you can have screen all around. So it's a really nice summertime tent. Normally they put a stove jack in these tents, but not in the 360. So I wanted to put one on my own, and now I've got it, and it's gonna be a full 4-season tent. Some cons of this option are that I'm a little uncertain about the longevity. I'm not sure if UV rays and water are going to degrade that adhesive all over time. It may need to be redone or reinforced down the road. And you really have to be fastidious and not take too many shortcuts in order to ensure good adhesion without any air pockets or ripples. It also requires several supplies compared to the alternatives. One alternative here, kind of like the sewing option, is you could look at just gluing down some Velcro strips with that tear mender and then just putting one of those Velcro stove jacks on top. I'm not sure if it'd be quite as strong. I also am not sure if I'd like how much tension would be on the canvas that could tear it later, but I think it could work. Just make sure you have an option where you've got a solid panel that can go over it so that you can also use it without a stove even if it's raining. Now this one is the easiest of all. This is the no-hole door stove jack option. I was pretty excited about this when I discovered this clip-on stove jack that I found on Amazon. There's a few different models, and this is just the one I got. It's called an ice mount. It comes with this jack and then this additional little clip depending on how you need to install it. This does not require any tools or any modifications or holes in your tent. And this device cost me $35. This is easily the easiest option and the lowest level of effort of any of these methods. I think it's best for occasional use, or if you just want to try out the hot tent thing and see if you like it. It does work best if you have dual door zippers, meaning zippers that come from above and below. And it's also really good for procrastinators who realize, oh, deer camp's next week, it's freezing cold and I'd like a stove in my tent, but I didn't do anything ahead of time. It's very easy to do. Once your tent is pitched, you're going to clip those little clips around the door. You're going to zip down as close as you can to it, and then you're going to run your flue pipe through it. Now, one hassle I found is that this didn't work very well on this Kodiak tent, this white duck tent, or that Teton Mesa tent, because they don't have dual zippers, meaning they don't have one that comes up from below. I actually did get this to work a little bit better on this Teton Mesa tent. I think given that bigger door, I think it just has a little more slack. So if it's zipped up all the way at the bottom here, and then you put it this way, you still have a gap there, but it's mostly closed off. So you wouldn't lose too much air, and that could be a viable solution. So it worked pretty well if I put it down low like this, and you had one of those tent stoves that shoots a chimney or a flue straight out the back, and then you need a 90-degree elbow that can shoot your chimney straight up and get it nice and high. That could be an option to get you going with a hot tent without making any modifications to your tent or avoiding any warranties. The pros of this are that it's not permanent. There's no permanent modifications that you have to make. This works with almost any tent, and it's ready on the spot. There's no DIY stuff you have to do in advance. You can just show up to the camp out and give it a whirl. The cons are that I think it's kind of janky. It's not the smoothest or best solution in my opinion. It's also going to be drafty because it's going to let a lot of air in, and in most cases you're probably not going to get your tent door totally sealed around it. It also blocks a door. You know, I guess some tents may have a window that would allow that, but in most cases this is going to have to go on a door. If you only have one door on your tent, you're gonna have to move that stove or work around that stove every time you go in and out, unclipping and clipping this. It's not gonna be very practical. You're not gonna wanna use it all the time. You'll probably only turn it on at night and then hope you don't have to go out because Mother Nature's calling. Probably one of the biggest cons I see to this too is that it may encourage people to put a tent stove in a tent that really shouldn't have one in there, especially thin polyester tents that could burn easily or melt even just from proximity to a flue. So this might be one of those hammers without a nail. But I'm curious, if you decide to give it a try, let me know how it goes in the comments. The fifth and final method to put a DIY stove jack in your tent is a minimalistic stove jack. The materials you'll need include some of this silicone fiberglass heat resistant material. Now, some places you might be able to just find a sheet of this. There's a lot of stove jacks that are made out of this, but I wanted one that I could cut to the size I wanted. And I actually found this little piece of material, which is pretty inexpensive, and it was just supposed to be like a tent stove or a wood stove camping mat. And I just cut it up to use as I wanted. The adhesive I'm using here is Gear Aid Seam Grip Sil. It's important to use a silicone compatible adhesive because this material is made of silicone. You have to have a silicone adhesive. A regular Gear Aid adhesive or others won't work. The tools you'll need include a knife, some scissors, a pin, and a putty knife. This only cost me about 30 bucks for everything. And I'd say the level of effort on this one is medium. Kind of like gluing the stove jack on the canvas tent. This took a little time to get everything dialed in. Plus there's the dry time. It just is going to take a little bit longer before it's totally done. I'd say this is best for synthetic tents, especially nylon, polyester, or seal nylon tents. It's also nice if you want it to remain very lightweight and low bulk. This should fold up nicely just like the tent did before. So if you're wanting to put a stove jack in a backpacking tent, this might be a good option. Here are your instructions. First, you're going to want to decide where you want to place your stove inside your tent or under your shelter. Next, you're going to mark the pipe exit location. Determine the size of the stove jack and then add 3 inches to the length and the width. Cut 2 identical pieces of the silicone fiberglass fabric to the previous dimensions that you just measured. One is going to be for the stove jack and one is going to be for the flap to cover the hole when you're not using a stove. Measure and cut the hole for the stovepipe in 1 piece of fabric. Align the stove jack and trace an outline on the tent fabric where it will go, around the exit point of the flue. Draw another rectangle on the tent, inset 1.5 inches from that stove jack location or that stove jack border. Cut out the inner rectangle from the tent material. Be sure not to cut the external rectangle. Now, using a little paintbrush, apply adhesive to the 1.5 inch frame on the inside of the tent and around the edges of your stove jack. So to both surfaces of both the jack and the tent. Now place the stove jack on the inside of the tent, inside of your outline. It's best to do this on a hard surface like a table so that you can get good adhesion. Once you place a stove jack on the inside of a tent and you've got it placed on a hard surface, use a putty knife to remove any creases or air bubbles. Just be sure not to evacuate all of that adhesive. It's best if you can let that dry for a while. Once you're ready, flip it over and on the exterior of the tent, apply adhesive to a 1.5 strip of the tent material just above the stove jack, above where it will go, and on the top strip of the flap. Do not apply adhesive to all 4 sides of the top flap. You only want to apply it along the top. That way it will flap open and flap closed. Then you're going to adhere the flap to the top on the exterior of the tent, and once that's set and you push those air bubbles out with the putty knife, go ahead and let that set for at least 24 hours before it's dry. All right, so I let this dry for a couple of days now, and I just wanted to see how it worked. This isn't the most beautiful job I've ever done, and there's some things you could do better if you try this. The adhesive I used, it worked okay. I think it would work even better if this was sil nylon and not polyester, but it does seem to be working. I did notice under here that these corners kind of come up a little bit. I think that's just part of what makes me question whether or not this is the best adhesive to use. So what I would recommend is that you test first. So you get just a little piece of this and a little piece of whatever your tent material is. Maybe just glue a little piece of this on there, let it sit for a day or two just to test and see how well it works in case you need to switch adhesives. Not pretty, but functional. I think this will work. I think it'll keep the water out. So far I'm satisfied for a very easy, cheap, and simple job, but there's some things you could do a little better. The pros of this option are that it's cheap and it's not very hard to do. It's also minimalistic and it's going to be very lightweight and eliminate bulk. However, this may not be the most weatherproof option because that flap could blow open, and depending on the materials and the adhesive you use, you may not be entirely confident as to how well it's going to hold up. I gotta be honest, right now longevity and durability are unknown. This may also make your tent prone to tears. Anytime you cut that polyester or synthetic materials especially, it can easily tear. If it's something like ripstop, that should help reduce that risk. And you're gonna have it glued, but especially when you put a lot of tension on a surface, that could be problematic, so just be aware of that and be careful of it. Okay, now here's a few pro tips before I wrap this up. Number 1, you can add one of these flashing kits to almost any of these DIY stove jack options. That can add another level of safety and security and sealing the elements out. Just like I have in this one right here that's pre-made that Velcros in one of my other tents. You also want to keep in mind that putting a stove jack in your tent may void your warranty. I've read on Teton's website, however, that they won't void your entire warranty if you do put a DIY stove jack in, although they won't replace or repair the tent if it's caused by your stove jack insertion. But anything else that goes wrong will still be covered. I'm not sure what other companies' policies are, but you might want to check that out if that's a concern for you. When you're deciding where to place your tent stove inside of your tent, consider the following. Number 1, heat dispersal. How cold does it get where and when you'll use this tent? More flue pipe inside will provide more heat inside. For example, in this bell tent, a center placement with the flue pipe going through the roof would provide the most heat inside. A side placement may be less efficient for heat. However, in my experience, it's not a deal breaker because most of these tent stoves provide plenty of heat for most of these tents, unless it's a very large tent or you're in very, very cold sub-zero conditions. Another thing to consider is sleeping arrangements. Having your tent stove just off center by the pole inside of a bell tent could provide the maximum amount of room for sleepers around the perimeter. However, having your tent stove placed in the center of, say, a Kodiak Flex-bow or a spring bar tent might be inconvenient to maneuver around. Placing a stove near a door helps contain the mess from wood coming in and out. That's my preference. However, on that Kodiak Flex-bow, where I place a stove jack, I put it towards the front of the tent, but not on the door side. That would allow easily to have 2 big cots, one blocking the back door, one against the far end, and still being able to come through the front door, move your wood in and out without being encumbered by the stove. Then you want to decide if you're going to put your stove jack in a wall or a roof. A hole in your roof that is often under tension could cause leaks or problems long term. A hole in the wall might be easier to waterproof, but it will require some additional angled flue segments. And no matter what, make sure that your flue pipe is long enough. The chimney should extend well above the height of your tent. Thank you folks for bearing with me and watching all that. But now, if you don't want to do any of these options and you'd rather just have a tent that's hot tent ready with a stove jack already built in, go watch this video next where I compare 2 spring bar tents that are hot tent ready side by side. Then gear up and get outside.